3 seconds. That was the exact window of time it took for a workplace dare to turn into a life-altering mistake. One impulsive kiss, one tattooed stranger, and a silence that fell over the bar so absolute, it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Amara didn't know it yet, but she hadn't just kissed a man, she had touched the gravity of a world she was never meant to enter. Hello, fams. Welcome to Afro Underworld Mafia Stories. Subscribe now and join us on this unforgettable journey. Don't forget to also comment below where you're watching from. Now let's proceed with the story. An hour earlier, the night had been routine. The rhythmic clinking of glasses, the vibrant pulse of Afrobeat, and the comfortable exhaustion of a long shift, just another night for Amara Okoye. She hadn't planned on playing games, and she certainly hadn't planned on placing her hand against the chest of a man who looked like he was carved from stone. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. Marco Valenti sat alone, a mountain of quiet dominance in a sea of chaos. He didn't look like he belonged to the music or the laughter, he looked like he owned the ground beneath it. When Amara kissed him, the music didn't stop. It faded into the background as her world narrowed down to the cold, unreadable grey of his eyes. As she pulled back, laughing off the dare with her heart racing, she missed the most important detail. The devil of the city hadn't blinked, and as she walked away, Marco Valenti's gaze stayed locked on her, marking her as the only thing in the room that finally mattered. Amara pulled back, a nervous, playful laugh bubbling in her throat as she smoothed her simple white button-down. She expected a reaction, a scold, a smirk, perhaps a startled curse, but the world around her had suddenly turned to stone. The vibrant pulse of Afrobeat seemed to vanish, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. She looked around, confused, finding her co-workers frozen with their trays midair, their eyes wide with a terror she couldn't comprehend. She turned her gaze back to the man she had just kissed. Marco Valenti didn't move. He sat like a mountain of quiet dominance, his broad shoulders filling the frame of the booth, his tattooed arm resting like a coiled serpent on the dark mahogany table. There was no surprise in his grey eyes, no amusement, and certainly no softness. He simply watched her with a serious, unreadable expression that made her impulsive touch feel like a transgression against a god. It was a dare, Amara stammered, her voice sounding thin and fragile in the vacuum of the bar's sudden quiet. She waited for him to speak, for the most silent man to break his streak, but he remained an immovable force. The crowd didn't dare to breathe. They knew who he was, even if she didn't. They saw the devil of the city where she saw only a stoic stranger. Amara took a step back, her hand dropping from his chest where it had rested with such naive instinct. The air between them tightened, vibrating with a static tension that warned her she had stepped into a world she was never meant to enter. She offered a final, shaky smile and turned to walk away, trying to shake off the feeling of his gaze boring into her back. She didn't see the way Marco's fingers flexed against the table, or the way his eyes tracked every inch of her movement. He had been marked by her innocence, and in return he had already decided that she belonged to the shadows of his world. For the next 3 weeks, the atmosphere in the bar shifted from a vibrant pulse to a heavy electric stillness that seemed to radiate from a single corner. Marco Valenti had become a ghost in the VIP booth, a permanent fixture of obsidian shadow amidst the neon blur of the nightlife. He sat there every night, broad-shouldered and immovable, filling the velvet-lined space with a quiet dominance that made the other patrons lower their voices without knowing why. He never ordered more than a single glass of neat whiskey that he rarely touched. His only real interest was the woman in the simple white button-down shirt, moving gracefully through the chaos. Amara felt his presence like a physical weight against her skin. Whenever she balanced a tray of drinks or navigated the crowded floor, she could feel his serious, unreadable gaze following her every movement. It wasn't the predatory look of the usual men who frequented the establishment. It was the focused, deliberate observation of a man who had decided she was the only thing in the room that mattered. Occasionally, when she caught his eye, he didn't blink or offer the small, polite smile of a stranger. He simply watched, his face a mask of controlled strength and zero amusement, allowing the silence between them to grow heavy with unsaid things. Her co-workers whispered in the break room about the silent man, who sat like a king in the dark, but Amara remained caught in the innocence of her own impulsive act. She still carried the memory of resting her hand against his tattooed chest, an instinctive touch that now felt like a mark she couldn't wash off. To the crowd, he was a mystery or a threat. To her, he was the gravity that anchored her shift. She would find herself lingering near his booth, her posture soft and forward-leaning, as if she were still unaware of the power she had stepped into. Marco didn't lean into her emotionally, yet he never looked away, his authority and restraint acting as a silent shield that seemed to push the rest of the world back, leaving only the two of them in a tightening circle of shared, dangerous silence. Amara noticed the change first in the way the air moved around her, as if the world had suddenly decided to be kind, though the kindness felt sharp and deliberate. It started with the rude regulars who usually made her shifts a grueling test of patience. One by one, the men who catcalled or snapped their fingers for service simply stopped coming. They were replaced by quiet, well-dressed men who occupied the corner booths, watching the door with a stillness that mirrored the most silent man she had kissed. Then the heavier burdens began to lift. The landlord who had been threatening her with eviction over a week's late rent arrived at her doorstep, not with a notice, but with a stammering apology and a receipt showing her balance was cleared for the next 6 months. Even the persistent cough that had been plucking at her lungs seemed to vanish when a premium nebulizer and a bag of top-tier medicine appeared in the staff locker room, labelled only with her name in a precise, elegant script. She should have felt relieved, but instead the silence of her life felt heavy. Every time she walked home, she felt a gaze on her back, not a predatory one, but a weight of absolute, unblinking focus. She would catch the glint of a black SUV idling at the edge of her vision, or notice that the streetlights in her dark neighborhood had all been mysteriously repaired overnight. Marco Valenti was cleaning up her reality, operating in the shadows to erase the friction of her existence without ever uttering a word. At the bar, the vibrant pulse of the music now seemed to muffle the truth she was beginning to sense. She would look toward the VIP booth, expecting to see the broad-shouldered mountain of a man who had allowed her impulsive touch, but the seat was often empty. Yet the heavy atmosphere remained. The other waitresses whispered about her luck, but Amara felt less like a lucky girl and more like a precious object being locked inside a vault. She realized that by treating the city's most dangerous man like a stranger, she hadn't just ended a dare. She had started a silent, invisible dialogue with a man who expressed his obsession through the absolute removal of her obstacles. The following week, the air in the bar remained charged, a persistent hum of electricity that centered around the corner booth Marco Valenti had claimed as his own. He was always there, a mountain of quiet dominance that seemed to anchor the chaotic room. Amara moved through her shifts with a new, fluttering self-consciousness, her simple white button-down feeling like a thin shield against the unreadable grey of his eyes. He never spoke more than a few words, and he never leaned into the moment, yet his presence was an immovable force that followed her every step. When his booth finally cleared on a Tuesday night, the silence he left behind felt heavier than the music. Amara approached the table to clear the glasses, her hand resting instinctively on the polished wood where he had sat. Amidst the condensation rings and a folded linen napkin, she found it, a sleek matte black card. It wasn't a credit card but something far more deliberate. Embossed in a subtle, raised gloss was a crest, a serpent coiled around a dagger. "Amara, don't touch that," a voice hissed. She looked up to see Marcus, the senior bartender, his face drained of color. He wasn't looking at her, he was staring at the card with a terror she couldn't comprehend. "It's just a tip, Marcus," she said, her brow furrowing as she picked up the card. It felt cold, heavy as lead in her palm. "He must have forgotten it." "He didn't forget it. That's a Valenti marker," Marcus whispered, pulling her away from the edge of the booth. "Do you have any idea who that silent man is? That's Marco Valenti. They call him the devil of the city." Amara looked back at the empty booth, her heart hammering against her ribs. The innocent, impulsive kiss she had shared on a dare suddenly felt like a brand. She had seen his tattoos and his broad-shouldered strength, but she had viewed them through a lens of kindness, oblivious to the predatory legacy they represented. The realization shattered her sense of safety. The invisible guardian she thought she had found was actually the head of the city's most feared crime family. She looked down at the black card in her hand, the serpent's eyes seemingly mocking her naivety. She hadn't just kissed a stranger, she had touched the gravity of a world she was never meant to enter. The room began to tilt as the weight of the Valenti name settled over her. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a girl who had stepped into the devil's shadow, and the devil never looked away once. The shift at the bar usually hummed with the predictable rhythm of a city winding down, but tonight the air felt jagged. Amara moved between the tables, her simple white button-down, a uniform that signaled she was there to serve, not to play, bright against the dim, neon-soaked shadows of the room. She felt a strange prickle on her skin, the same sensation she'd carried since the dare that had changed everything. Marco Valenti wasn't in his usual booth, yet his heavy silence seemed to linger in the corner like a physical weight. The violence didn't start with a shout, it started with the shattering of a glass. 3 men, dressed in the sharp, anonymous suits of a rival syndicate, stepped from the darkness near the service entrance. They weren't there for a drink, they were looking for the soft spot Marcus Valenti had inadvertently revealed to the city. Before Amara could process the shift in the room, the bar erupted into a terrifying chaos of splintering wood and muffled gunshots. Amara dove behind the mahogany counter, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was smaller in stature, built for grace and service, not the visceral brutality of a mafia power struggle. As she huddled on the floor, the stark white of her shirt caught the flashing red of the emergency lights, making her a glowing target in the gloom. "Where is she?" a voice rasped, cold and devoid of mercy. A hand gripped Amara's shoulder, dragging her upward. In the struggle, a stray shard of glass sliced across her arm, and a bloom of crimson began to spread across her sleeve. The blood on the white shirt was a visceral mark of her transition from an innocent waitress to a casualty of the Valenti legacy. Suddenly the front doors didn't just open, they were obliterated. Marco Valenti stepped into the fray, his broad-shouldered frame filling the doorway like an immovable force of nature. He didn't look like a man coming to negotiate. He looked like the devil of the city, coming to reclaim what was his. His eyes, usually unreadable and stoic, flared with a murderous intensity the moment they landed on the red stain, soaking into Amara's white cotton. The world narrowed to the space between them. For the first time, Amara saw the dangerous, deliberate control Marco possessed translate into action. The mafia world hadn't just spilled into her bar, it had stained her life, forcing her to realize that the man she had kissed on a dare was the only wall standing between her and the abyss. The warehouse smelled of stagnant river water and the metallic tang of old grease, a far cry from the vibrant, jasmine-scented world Amara usually inhabited. She stood in the center of the concrete floor, her simple white button-down now wrinkled and stained, a stark contrast to the darkness pressing in around her. Marco Valenti stepped out of the shadows, his presence alone seemingly to drop the temperature of the room. He was no longer the silent man from the bar. He was a mountain of quiet dominance, his eyes like polished flint as they swept over the rival enforcers holding Amara. "She is a civilian, Morty." Marco's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "The code says we do not bring shadows to the doorsteps of the innocent." The rival leader sneered, pressing a cold barrel against Amara's temple. "The code died the moment you let a waitress touch your heart, Valenti. Your men think you've gone soft, they think you're weak." Amara looked at Marco, her eyes wide but surprisingly steady. She saw the tension in his broad shoulders, the way his tattooed arm flexed with a lethal, controlled strength. For the first time, she understood the weight of the power he carried, a power that decided who lived and who died. The devil of the city was standing before her, and the empire he had built was demanding a blood sacrifice to prove his loyalty to the crown. "Rules are for men who are afraid of what they might become," Marco said, his gaze never leaving Amara's. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, ignoring the guns leveled at his chest. He wasn't leaning into the moment emotionally. He was commanding it, signaling an authority that transcended their petty power struggle. "I am not afraid, but if you touch her, I will burn this city down just to see your ashes." In that moment of absolute stillness, Marco chose. He reached for his weapon, not to defend his title or his territory, but to shield the girl who had dared to kiss the most silent man in the room. The standoff shattered as Marco moved with the grace of a predator, his world finally narrowing down to the only thing that mattered. He wasn't choosing his empire, he was choosing the light he had found in her eyes, even if it meant becoming a traitor to his own blood. The rain hammered against the windows of the hospital's private terrace, a rhythmic drumming that filled the space between them. For the first time since the night of the dare, the silence between Amara and Marco wasn't heavy with the threat of violence or the sharp edge of authority. It was a hollow, weary silence. Marco sat on the stone bench, his broad shoulders hunched as if the weight of the Valenti Empire was finally pressing through his skin. He looked at his hands, the same hands that the city whispered about in fear, and saw only the stains of a legacy he hadn't chosen. "People think silence is a choice I make to look powerful," he said, his voice barely rising above the storm. "They think it's a tactic." He turned his gaze to Amara, and for the first time his grey eyes weren't cold, they were exhausted. But when every word you speak can start a war or end a life, you eventually stop wanting to speak at all. You become a prisoner of your own name. Amara moved closer, her presence a soft contrast to his rigid frame. She didn't see the devil of the city or the most serious man in the bar. She saw a man who had forgotten how to breathe without checking for shadows. The silence in the bar that night. "I thought you were just judging me for being foolish," she murmured. Marco let out a short, hollow breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "I wasn't judging you, I was envying you. You moved without permission, you touched me without fear. I haven't had a moment that wasn't calculated since I was 10 years old." He leaned back, the light of the terrace catching the sharp line of his jaw. "My father taught me that to lead is to be a wall, but walls don't feel anything, Amara. They just wait to be knocked down." He described the black book of his family, the ledgers of debt, and the endless cycle of retaliations that kept him awake until dawn. He spoke of the shadow board that watched his every move, waiting for a single flicker of humanity to label as weakness. The burden of his serious life wasn't the danger, it was the isolation. Amara reached out, her hand resting lightly on his tattooed arm, not as a dare this time but as an anchor. "You don't have to be a wall with me, Marco." He looked down at her hand, his body language finally losing its habitual restraint. In that moment the mafia boss vanished. He was just a man who had spent 20 years in a cold room, finally catching a glimpse of the sun. He realized then that the kiss hadn't disrupted his world, it had offered him a way out of it. The neon glow of the bar felt different tonight, tainted by an undercurrent of predatory stillness that Amara couldn't quite name. She moved through the crowd in her simple white button-down, unaware that the harmless dare from weeks ago had become a beacon for Marco's enemies. In the dark corners of the city, the rival Morty syndicate had watched the devil of the city soften, his broad-shouldered frame becoming a regular fixture in the shadows of Amara's workplace. They didn't see a man finding his humanity, they saw a king who had finally provided them with a target. The trap was set with surgical precision. A group of men, dressed not as soldiers but as rowdy tourists, occupied the center tables, creating a deliberate disturbance that demanded the manager's attention. It was a siren's call designed to pull Marco out of his defensive shell. From his usual booth Marco watched, his face a mask of unreadable granite, his tattooed arm resting perfectly still against the leather. He sensed the shift in the room's gravity, the way the air tightened, just as it had the night Amara first touched his chest. When one of the men intentionally tripped Amara, sending her tray of glasses shattering across the floor, the silent man didn't hesitate. He rose, his muscular build filling the frame of the room with a dominance that signaled he was taking control. As he stepped into the light to shield her, the rowdy tourists reached beneath their jackets. The bar, once a place of laughter and half-empty glasses, transformed into a kill zone. "Amara, get down," Marco commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the chaos. The first shot shattered the mirror behind the bar, sending the crowd into a panicked scream. Amara crouched behind the mahogany counter, her face relaxed no longer, finally understanding the terrifying weight of the power she had stepped into. She watched through the gap in the woodwork as Marco moved with a lethal, controlled strength, a man used to deciding what happens next. He wasn't just fighting for his territory anymore, he was fighting to keep the light in her eyes from being extinguished by the shadows of his own legacy. The siren's trap had sprung, but the Mortys had underestimated one thing: Marco Valenti was never more dangerous than when he had something precious to lose. The neon pulse of the city felt distant, a fadding heartbeat as Marco and Amara stepped out of the bar and into the cool midnight air. For the first time in a decade, Marco didn't signal for the armored SUV idling at the curb, nor did he look to the shadows for his security detail. With a single, subtle wave of his hand, he dismissed the Empire. He wasn't the devil of the city tonight. He was simply a man walking beside the woman who had dared to see past his mask. They walked in a comfortable, weighted silence that mirrored the night of their first encounter, but the tension had shifted from predatory to protective. Amara's small stature was tucked safely against his broad-shouldered frame, her simple white button-down a bright contrast to the dark tailored blazer he had draped over her shoulders to ward off the chill. "You're very quiet, Marco," Amara murmured, her voice soft against the backdrop of distant sirens. "I'm listening," he replied, his serious, unsmiling face softening just enough for her to see the man beneath the authority. "I've spent a long time commanding rooms. I've forgotten how to just be in one." Amara smiled, the same relaxed and fearless expression that had shattered his ironclad control months ago. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm, no longer an impulsive dare but a deliberate choice. Under the amber glow of the streetlights, Marco realized that his power hadn't been found in the fear he instilled in the syndicate, but in the vulnerability he allowed himself to feel here, in the quiet streets of her neighborhood. When they reached the stoop of her apartment, the air didn't tighten with danger, it settled with the promise of a future. Marco didn't demand her attention or lean into his dominance. Instead, he stood before her as an equal, the mafia boss, a shadow he had left behind at the bar. "Thank you for walking me home, Marco," she said, leaning in to brush a kiss against his cheek, a soft, lingering echo of the act that had changed everything. As she turned the key in her lock, Marco waited until she was safely inside. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, breathing in the cold air, finally free from the heavy silence of his own making. He wasn't watching her as a predator anymore. He was a man who had finally found his way home.